The day Letitia Bailey arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with nothing but a battered trunk, a loaded derringer tucked into her boot, and a deed to 40 acres of land she had never laid eyes on, she made herself one solemn promise. She would not let a single soul in this dusty, sun-scorched territory tell her what she could and could not do with her life. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell was not a gentle place. It sat right at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man leaning over a cliff, half wild and half trying to be something better than wild. The main street was a river of red mud, churned by cattle hooves and wagon wheels. Saloons breathed piano music and whiskey fumes into the afternoon air. Cowboys lined the hitching posts like fence rails, dusty and squinting and loud. The smell of livestock was everywhere, and the Kansas wind did not apologize for anything. Letitia stepped down from the stagecoach and stood in the mud with her trunk at her feet and looked at all of it. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, with brown eyes that had seen enough disappointment to make them serious but not enough to make them hard. She wore a practical brown traveling dress that had been mended at the hem twice, and she wore it like armor. She was the kind of woman who did not ask for help, but could receive it with grace if it was offered correctly. She had come from St. Louis, where she had spent the last 4 years working as a seamstress after her father died and left debts instead of the inheritance she had expected. Before that, she had been taught by her father to keep the books for his small dry goods store, to negotiate with suppliers, to read a contract carefully and trust nothing that was not written down. Those skills had kept her fed in St. Louis. She intended for them to keep her alive in Kansas. The 40 acres had come to her through her late mother's side of the family, a great uncle she had barely known, a man named Clifford Darnell who had gone west in the 1850s and built himself a small homestead before dying without a wife or children to leave it to. The lawyers in St. Louis had tracked Letitia down as the closest living heir. The letter had taken 6 weeks to find her. She had read it 3 times before she believed it, and then she had sold everything she owned that was not essential, packed the rest, and bought her stagecoach ticket. She had a deed and she had directions. She had 40 acres of Kansas prairie with a small sod house that she had never seen, but intended to make into something real. She was not a woman who needed someone to do things for her. She needed information, supplies, and time, and she fully intended to get all 3. The first person she spoke to in Caldwell was a woman named Mrs. Opal Greer, who ran the boarding house on the eastern end of the main street, and who, Letitia would quickly learn, knew everything about everyone in the surrounding 50 miles. Opal was a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes, and she sized Letitia up in about 4 seconds and apparently decided she liked what she saw. "You need a room," Opal said, not as a question. "1 night," Letitia said. "Maybe 2 while I arrange for a wagon to take me out to the Darnell property." Opal's sharp eyes sharpened further. "Clifford Darnell's place. You're the Darnell heir, Letitia Bailey, his great-niece." Opal nodded slowly and took the trunk from Letitia's hands with a strength that was surprising. "You'll want more than 2 nights," she said, "and you'll want to talk to Daniel Hawkins before you go out there." "Who is Daniel Hawkins?" Letitia asked, following her inside. "The man whose land borders yours on 2 sides," Opal said, setting the trunk down at the foot of a narrow but clean bed. "He's been running cattle across that property since Clifford took sick 3 years back. Came to an arrangement with Clifford, a handshake deal. Now Clifford is dead and you're here and Daniel does not yet know there's a new owner." She paused. "He's a reasonable man, but he is going to have opinions." "I have been handling men with opinions my entire life," Letitia said pleasantly, and hung her traveling coat on the peg by the door. She did not meet Daniel Hawkins that first evening. She spent the evening eating a decent supper at Opal's table, talking with the other 2 boarders, a traveling merchant named Prescott and a young schoolteacher newly arrived from Ohio named Clara Finch, and listening to everything she could about the land and the people and the general shape of life in this part of Kansas. She asked questions carefully. She listened more than she spoke. By the time she went to bed, she had a clearer picture of what she was walking into than most people arrived with after a month in the territory. Daniel Hawkins, she learned, was 29 years old and had come to Kansas from Texas 6 years ago with nothing but a good horse and a reputation for being both stubborn and honorable, which in the cattle business was apparently the most useful combination a man could have. He had built his ranch, the Double H, people called it, from 30 head of cattle and a borrowed chuck wagon into something genuinely impressive. He had 4 permanent hands working for him and brought on seasonal cowboys during the trail drives. He was not rich by any Eastern measure, but he was solid, people said. He was a man who kept his word. He was also, Clara Finch confided with some color in her cheeks, very good-looking in the way that working in the sun and wind for years tends to make a man weathered and lean and direct-eyed, the kind of face that did not perform for anyone. Letitia did not care much about that particular detail, but she filed it away out of habit because information was information. She met him the next morning. She was at the land office when he came in. She had arrived early, the way she always arrived to things she considered important, and she was already seated across from the land agent, a nervous, bespectacled man named Mr. Hofstetter, when the door opened and Daniel Hawkins walked in, and it was immediately clear from the way he walked that he was a man who was used to land, to space, to the particular authority that comes from knowing exactly where you belong on the earth. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark blonde hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving. He wore a brown hat pushed back on his head, and his boots were already dusty at 9 in the morning. His eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that Letitia's mind catalogued as sea-colored before she reminded herself that she had not come to Kansas to notice men's eyes. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a brief silence in which Mr. Hofstetter cleared his throat very quietly. "Miss Bailey," said Mr. Hofstetter, "this is Daniel Hawkins, your neighbor." "Mr. Hawkins," Letitia said, and extended her hand the way she had always done with businessmen in St. Louis, clean and direct and not coy about it. He looked at her hand for one beat of surprise. She suspected women in Caldwell did not generally open negotiations with a handshake, and then he took it and shook it once, firmly. His hand was large and very calloused and warm. "Miss Bailey," he said. His voice was low and even with the slow cadence of Texas in it still. "I heard you'd arrived. Mrs. Greer is a thorough woman," Letitia said, and let go of his hand. "She is," he agreed. He pulled out the other chair across from Mr. Hofstetter and sat in it, setting his hat on his knee. "I expect you want to discuss the arrangement I had with your great-uncle." "I do," she said. Mr. Hofstetter was just about to explain the legal situation regarding any informal agreements that were made before Mr. Darnell's death. Mr. Hofstetter looked like he would rather be anywhere else on earth. He adjusted his spectacles. "Well, as I was saying to Miss Bailey, informal arrangements, handshake deals, are not legally binding when a property changes ownership. The new owner is under no obligation to honor. I understand that," Daniel said, and he said it without heat, which Letitia found herself noting. A man who could hear something he did not like and respond without heat was worth paying attention to. "I'm not here to argue legal obligation. I came to introduce myself and to discuss what might be fair going forward." Letitia tilted her head slightly. "What did you consider fair with my great-uncle?" "I ran cattle across the northern and eastern quarter of the property in exchange for keeping the fence line in repair and providing Clifford with a side of beef every October," Daniel said. "When he took sick, I added bringing him supplies from town twice a month. That was my choice, not an obligation." "That was decent of you," Letitia said, and she meant it, which surprised her slightly. "What are you hoping for now?" "Access to the northern grazing land, same as before. My property doesn't have enough grass in a dry year without it. I'd pay fair grazing fees rather than trade in kind since our situations are different." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know what you plan to do with the property, Miss Bailey, so I can't know if my needs and yours are going to be in conflict." It was a fair and intelligent thing to say. Letitia respected it. "I plan to homestead it," she said. "I've filed the relevant paperwork. I intend to raise a kitchen garden and some livestock for personal use and eventually to grow grain if the land supports it. I'm not planning to run cattle, not at first, so the northern grazing land is not something I have immediate use for." She watched his face during this, and she saw something shift in it, not quite surprise, but a recalibration. He had expected something different, she thought. Perhaps he had expected her to sell. "You plan to work it yourself," he said. "With hired help as I can afford it, yes," she said. "I have managed accounts and negotiated contracts. I know how to work. I do not know how to work this particular land yet, but I intend to learn. I would welcome advice from neighbors who know the territory if it was given without condescension." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the suggestion of one, the way the horizon suggests morning before any light actually arrives. "I can manage that," he said. "Miss Bailey, I think we can come to a fair arrangement on the grazing rights. And I'll have my man Hayes fix your northern fence line before the month is out, at my expense." "I'll pay half," she said immediately. He blinked at her. "You pay for the materials, I pay for the labor," she said. "That is fair, and it keeps the accounting clean between neighbors. I prefer clean accounting." There was a pause, and then Daniel Hawkins did fully smile, just briefly, and it changed his face considerably, made it less composed, more alive. "All right," he said. "We have a deal." She did not let herself notice that the smile did things to the quality of light in the room. She was too practical for that kind of nonsense. She was almost entirely certain she was too practical for it. She moved out to the Darnell property, her property. She was already training herself to think of it that way 4 days after arriving in Caldwell. She hired a man named Tom Garrett to drive a rented wagon out with her trunk and the supplies she had purchased from the general store, and she got her first look at 40 acres of Kansas prairie with a sod house at the center of it and felt something complicated move through her chest. It was not beautiful exactly. The sod house was low and dark and smelled of old earth and disuse. The kitchen garden had gone entirely wild. The well needed cleaning. The small barn had a collapsed wall on the western side. The fence line was exactly as bad as she had feared. But the land itself, the long grass shivering in the wind, the enormous sky, the particular way the late afternoon light lay across it all golden and unhurried, that was something. She stood in it for a long time after Tom Garrett left, just stood in her property in the wind and looked at all of it, and she felt something she had not felt since before her father died, which was the specific and sustaining feeling of possibility. She set to work immediately. That was another thing about Letitia Bailey. She did not stand still for long when there was work to do. She cleaned the sod house from top to bottom, which took 2 full days and left her with a muscle ache that spread from her shoulders to the base of her spine. She dug out the kitchen garden and planted the seeds she had bought in Caldwell: beans, squash, tomatoes, onions, and she cleaned the well and pronounced the water good. She made arrangements with a farmer named Jeb Coates, who lived 7 miles to the west, to purchase 2 laying hens and a young milk cow that Coates was selling cheap because she was difficult to milk. The cow, Letitia named Frances. Frances was indeed difficult to milk. Letitia learned to milk her anyway, through sheer persistence, and what amounted to a diplomatic negotiation with the animal each morning, and eventually they arrived at a mutual understanding that served them both. She had been on the property 9 days when Daniel Hawkins rode up. She was on the roof of the sod house at the time, laying fresh sod over a section that had developed a leak. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, and she straightened up and shaded her eyes and watched him come across the northern field at an easy lope, the kind of riding that looks effortless because it is the product of thousands of hours of practice. He pulled up below the house and tipped his hat back and looked up at her on the roof. "I was going to ask how you were settling in," he said, "but I can see." "The roof was leaking," she said, and pressed another square of sod into place. He dismounted without being invited, tied his horse to the hitching post that she had repaired with a new rail last Tuesday, and stood with his hands on his hips looking up at her work. "You're laying that backwards," he said. "The grass side wants to face down. It stitches together better that way." She stopped. She looked at what she had done. She looked at what he was describing. He was right. "Thank you," she said, and pulled up the piece she had just laid and turned it over. He came up onto the roof. There was a ladder she had propped against the eastern wall, and without asking or making a production of it, started working alongside her from the other end of the problem section. They worked in silence for a while, and it was a comfortable silence, the kind that did not require filling. The wind moved the grass below them and pushed at the edges of Letitia's bonnet. Somewhere to the north, cattle lowed in the middle distance. "The barn wall," he said after a while. "You have materials for it." "I have timber," she said. "I need more hands than I currently possess. I'll send Hayes over with one of the other men on Saturday if that works." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the roof, not at her. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her then. "Because you're my neighbor and the barn wall needs fixing," he said. "And because Clifford Darnell was a good man and he would have wanted the place looked after." She held his gaze for a moment. Something in his directness made it easy and slightly uncomfortable at the same time, the way true honesty often is. "Saturday works," she said. "I'll provide the noon meal." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to clean accounting, Mr. Hawkins." He almost smiled again. "Clean accounting," he agreed. Hayes and a young cowboy named Pete arrived on Saturday with their tools and their easy ranch hand competence, and between the four of them, Letitia worked alongside them without any pretense about it. The barn wall was rebuilt by mid-afternoon. She fed them a meal of beans and cornbread and apple pie made from the dried apples she had brought from St. Louis. And Hayes, who was a broad-shouldered, sun-darkened man of about 40 with the permanent squint of someone who had spent his life reading weather, told her it was the best apple pie he had eaten since his mother's in Georgia. And he said it with such genuine feeling that Letitia believed him entirely. Daniel came over himself that evening, after Hayes and Pete had ridden back. She saw him coming and was not surprised and told herself she was not glad, exactly, just satisfied that the barn wall situation was being properly followed up. She poured him coffee and they sat on the 2 wooden chairs she had dragged outside to face the sunset, because the evening was too fine to waste inside, and the sky was turning colors that did not exist in St. Louis in quite that way, deep orange and rose and the particular purple of new dusk. "Hayes says your pie is exceptional," he said. "Hayes is a kind man," she said. "He is not actually prone to being kind about food," Daniel said. "He is extremely particular about food. He once refused to eat anything at a cattle camp for 2 days because the cook was using the wrong kind of beans." Letitia laughed. It surprised her slightly, the fullness of it. She was not a woman who laughed easily, not in recent years, and the sound of it in the prairie evening felt like something released. Daniel looked at her with a quiet attentiveness, as though he had heard the same thing she had. He looked away again at the horizon. "You're doing well out here," he said, "better than most people who arrive without experience." "I was prepared for it to be difficult," she said, "and I was not wrong." "What was it like in St. Louis?" he asked. It was said with genuine curiosity, not with the slightly patronizing tone of someone who cannot imagine why a woman from a city would come to the prairie and wants her to explain herself. So she told him something honest. She told him about the seamstress work and the bookkeeping before that in her father's store, and the way St. Louis could feel very small when you were in it without money and without family, and without a future that you had chosen for yourself. She told him about reading the lawyer's letter and the feeling, the specific, physical feeling of a door opening somewhere in her chest. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt and he did not offer sympathy in the slightly condescending way of someone who considers your struggles to be charming misfortunes. He just listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I understand that, the door opening. I had that when I left Texas." "Why did you leave?" she asked, because he had listened to her and it was fair. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "My father had a ranch. I worked it with him for years. When he died, he left it to my older brother, which was custom at the time, and I didn't dispute it. But there was nothing there for me after that. My brother and I did not see things the same way." He paused. "I came north with enough to get started and a great deal of stubbornness, and I built something. I plan to keep building it." "What are you building toward?" she asked. The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, as though he had not expected it to be asked that directly. He looked at the sunset for a moment. "Something lasting," he said. "Something that means something beyond just the acreage and the head count. A place that's worth passing on." "To whom?" she asked. He glanced at her sideways. "I haven't figured out that part yet," he said, and there was something careful in his voice that she noted and did not pursue. The weeks passed, and then a month, and then 6 weeks, and by the end of June Letitia's kitchen garden was productive and her chickens were laying reliably, and Frances had become mostly cooperative about the milking. She had established a routine that suited her up before dawn: the animals first, then the garden, then whatever project the property most urgently demanded, then her accounts in the evenings by lamplight, because she kept meticulous records of everything she spent and earned and owed. She made 2 other friends besides Opal Greer, who she visited in town once a week for supplies. Clara Finch, the schoolteacher, had taken a position at the small school south of Caldwell, and she rode out to visit Letitia on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, full of stories about her students and her own adjustments to frontier life. Clara was 23 and earnest and very clever, and she made Letitia laugh in the particular way of someone who sees the absurdity in things clearly. The other friend was a woman named Rosa Delgado, who lived 3 miles to the south with her husband and 2 small children on a homestead they had built up from nothing over 6 years. Rosa was 32 and had hands that were as calloused as any man's and a warmth that she gave freely and without performance. She taught Letitia how to put up preserves and how to read the Kansas sky for weather, skills that turned out to be equally essential. She also saw Daniel regularly, more regularly than the situation technically demanded. He had an easy reason to come by. The grazing arrangement meant his cattle were on her north pasture, and there were always small things to check, small things to discuss. She began to notice that sometimes the things he stopped by to discuss were quite small indeed, smaller than the ride over would seem to justify, and she began to wonder, with a cautious and practical part of her mind, what that meant. What she knew was that she liked talking to him. She had not expected to like it as much as she did. He was a man who thought before he spoke and who meant what he said when he said it, and in her experience both those things were rarer than they should be. He knew the land with a depth that fascinated her, not just the practical knowledge of cattle and fences, but the particular poetry of it, the names and habits of the birds, the way certain grasses signaled water underneath, the patterns in the soil that told a story of decades. He also, she began to notice, watched her, not in the way that made her want to step backwards. In the way of someone paying attention, genuinely paying attention, as though what she did and said and thought were things he found worth the effort of understanding. In July, there was a social gathering at the Coates farm, a barn dance, one of the occasions that served as both entertainment and community infrastructure in the isolated homesteads of the Kansas prairie. Letitia went with Rosa and Rosa's husband Miguel, a quiet, steady man who looked at his wife with the kind of settled devotion that Letitia had never seen up close and did not quite know what to do with, the way you feel slightly disoriented standing in front of a very fine painting that you were not prepared for. Daniel was there. He was leaning against the barn wall talking to Hayes when she arrived, and when he saw her he straightened slightly and came across the barn floor toward her with a directness that was characteristic of him. No circling or hedging, just a man who knew which direction he was going. "You came," he said, as though this was good news that had not been certain. "Rosa convinced me," she said. "She said there would be fiddle music." "There will be," he said. Jeb Coates plays, and his son-in-law, they're quite good. They were quite good, and the dancing was the lively, communal kind, square dances and reels, called out by old Mr. Brannigan, who had been calling dances in this part of Kansas since before it was Kansas. Letitia had not danced in years. She had not been certain she remembered how. Daniel asked her to dance after the third reel, and she said yes before she had entirely decided to, and then they were on the barn floor with the fiddles going and Mr. Brannigan calling, and it turned out her body remembered what her mind had forgotten. He was a good dancer. This should not have surprised her, a man with that kind of physical competence and coordination. But it did slightly, the way he moved, easy and sure, and with a kind of contained pleasure in it. When the dance brought them face to face and hand to hand, he looked at her with that direct gray-green attention, and she felt something she recognized with a kind of resigned clarity as inconvenient. She was falling in love with her neighbor. She had been doing it slowly and without adequate supervision for 6 weeks, and here it was arriving at the surface. She danced with him twice more that evening, and when she wasn't dancing, she talked with Rosa and Clara and Opal Greer, who had come in from town and was currently holding court in the corner with the authority of a woman who has had the best information in the county for 30 years. She was aware of Daniel across the barn, not in an anxious way, just in the steady, background way of a compass aware of north. At the end of the evening, when Rosa and Miguel were getting their wagon ready, Daniel walked Letitia outside into the blue Kansas dark, where the fireflies were going, and the stars were the kind of enormous that cities forget stars can be. "I'll ride out with you," he said. "It's dark and your road goes past my property anyway." "I have a lantern and a derringer," she said. "I know you do," he said. "Come on." She rode next to Rosa's wagon and Daniel rode alongside her on his horse, and they did not talk much, which was fine, which was more than fine, which was the particular comfort of silence between people who have found that they can be quiet together without it being empty. At the turn to her property, where their roads divided, he pulled up and touched his hat to her, the easy courtesy of a Western man, and said good night. And she said good night, and rode home through the dark with the lantern swinging and her mind doing things she told it firmly to stop doing. The morning after the barn dance, Letitia sat at her small table with her accounts book open and her coffee cooling beside her, and she had an honest conversation with herself about what was happening. She was not a woman who indulged in prolonged self-deception. Self-deception was expensive, and she had never been able to afford it. She was developing feelings for Daniel Hawkins. This was complicated for a number of reasons. The primary reason was that she had come to Kansas with a specific purpose, to build something of her own, something that belonged to her, and that she had built through her own intelligence and labor. She had spent enough of her adult life having her circumstances determined by other people, first her father, then the financial situation his death left her in. This land was the first thing that was fully, legally, unambiguously hers. She was protective of it in a way that went deeper than property. She had seen enough of the world to know what happened to women's independent lives when they married. In 1878 in Kansas, a wife's property became her husband's property. Her choices became subject to his approval. It was the law and the custom both, and Letitia had too much self-knowledge to imagine she could enter into that arrangement and be at peace with it. So she locked the feeling away behind the practical considerations, and she went on with her work, which was considerable. The summer was full and demanding and good. The garden produced abundantly. She sold excess vegetables at the market in Caldwell twice a month, which brought in small but meaningful income. She was already thinking about expanding the garden next year, and she had begun asking careful questions about what the grain market looked like in this part of Kansas. Daniel continued to come by. She continued to be glad he did and to talk herself out of being glad, which was not an entirely successful campaign. In August, a situation arose that forced things out of the private space she had been keeping them in. 2 men arrived at her property on a Tuesday afternoon, men she had never seen, riding horses that were good quality and recently acquired in the way of men who have money for horses but whose own everything else suggested the money was not honestly come by. They introduced themselves as agents for a cattle operation out of Abilene, and they wanted to talk to her about buying her 40 acres. She listened to their offer, which was considerably below the land's value, with her hands folded in her lap and her expression neutral. She told them she was not interested in selling. They said the offer was generous. She said she was not interested. They said she might find it harder than she expected, a woman alone out here managing all of this, and there was something in the way they said it that was not quite a threat but was not quite not a threat either, and she felt a cold, clear anger move through her. "I manage perfectly well," she said. "You can tell whoever sent you that this property is not for sale and will not be for sale. Good afternoon." They left. But the way they left, slow, deliberate, looking back at her from the saddle, stayed with her through the afternoon, a low-grade unease she could not entirely dismiss. She told Daniel about it the next time she saw him, which was 2 days later when he came to check the fence line on the north pasture. She told him simply, without dramatizing it, because she wanted his local knowledge, not his protectiveness. He listened with his jaw set and his eyes gone hard. "Caldwell Consolidated," he said. "That's who it'll be. They've been buying up land east of town, some of it willingly, some of it less so." He looked at her. "Did they threaten you directly?" "They implied it might be difficult being alone," she said. "It was not explicit." "I'll put the word out," he said. "People need to know they're operating in this area, and you should tell the sheriff." "I plan to," she said. "I know how to document a situation." He nodded, but something in his face had gone tense in a way she could see was about more than just the practical situation. He looked at the ground for a moment and then back at her, and what was in his face then was something she was not prepared for, unguarded and direct, and a little bit unhappy with itself. "Letitia," he said, and the use of her given name, the first time he had used it, made something happen in her chest that she could not categorize precisely. I want you to know that I consider you my nearest neighbor and my friend, and I am not indifferent to what happens to you." The word friend landed carefully between them. He seemed to know it was inexact. "I appreciate that," she said just as carefully. There was a pause that had weather in it. "I'll ride into town with you if you're going to the sheriff," he said. "I can manage the sheriff on my own," she said. "But thank you." She went to the sheriff that Friday, and Daniel was right that she could not go to the sheriff on her own and have it be entirely uncomplicated, because the sheriff, a man named Harlan Briggs, not corrupt but not particularly imaginative either, listened to her account and then explained that without an explicit threat, there was not much official action he could take. She told him she understood and documented the visit in her accounts book anyway, with the date and time and what was said on both sides, because you documented everything, especially the things that might matter later. September came, cool and golden, and with it, the first real harvest from her expanded garden. She filled her root cellar with potatoes and turnips and dried beans, and put up 30 jars of tomatoes and 20 of apple butter. And she stood in her cellar at the end of the preserving season, and felt a satisfaction that was almost physical, the satisfaction of being genuinely prepared for what was coming, of having made yourself equal to winter through your own sustained effort. Rosa came over the day after the last preserving was done, and they sat outside in the September afternoon sun and drank coffee, and Rosa said, with the direct warmth that was entirely characteristic of her, that Daniel Hawkins is a good man. "He is," Letitia agreed, and kept her voice entirely level. Rosa looked at her. Rosa was 32 and had been watching people for 32 years, and she was very good at it. "He rides over here more than the cattle situation requires," she said pleasantly. "He is a considerate neighbor," Letitia said. "He is," Rosa agreed. "And he is considerate in the particular direction of your front porch with some regularity." Letitia set down her coffee cup. "Rosa," she said. "I'm not saying anything," Rosa said. I am just observing, a friend observes. What you are observing, Letitia said, is more complicated than it looks. It rarely is, said Rosa. Or perhaps it is complicated in the way we make it complicated, not in the way it has to be. Letitia thought about that for a long time after Rosa went home. She was still thinking about it on a Thursday evening in early October when Daniel arrived with a purpose that was different from his usual arrivals. She could see it in the way he dismounted, too careful, too deliberate, the way a man moves when he has decided to do something that requires nerve. He sat in the other wooden chair, the one she had already begun to think of as his chair, and she poured the coffee and they talked about the fence line and the first cold nights, and the condition of the north pasture as the grass dried back, and all of it was normal and easy, and underneath it was something that was neither normal nor easy. And then he put his coffee cup down and he said, "Letitia, I have a proposition." She looked at him and waited. "I have been thinking," he said, with the measured care of a man choosing every word, "about the fact that my property and your property together would make something considerably more substantial than either of them separately. The grazing land, your grain potential, the water rights combined, it would be a genuinely strong holding." He paused. "I have also been thinking about the fact that those men from Caldwell Consolidated are more likely to leave you alone if the situation is less solitary." She understood where this was going. She felt two contradictory things at once, a warmth that she had been keeping under strict management for months, and a cold, specific resistance that came from everything she knew about what he was actually describing. "You are proposing a merger," she said, "of the properties." He met her eyes. "I am proposing marriage," he said. "I want to be honest about what I mean." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved outside, the lamp flickered. "Tell me something," she said carefully. "When you imagine what we would have together, you and I, what do you see?" He looked surprised by the question, as though he had prepared for a different kind of response. "A stronger ranch," he said. "A combined holding that could really build into something, more security, a life." "A ranch," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him steadily, and she said something that had been sitting in her for months, something she had not said to anyone, but that was true all the way down to its roots. "Daniel," she said, "I do not want a ranch. I want a partner." The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges the furniture. He looked at her. His gray-green eyes were very serious and very present. She could see him taking in what she had said, not just the surface of it, but the thing underneath it, all the weight of what she meant and why she meant it and what it had cost her to say it clearly instead of softly. "Same thing," he said. It was so simple and so direct that for a moment she just looked at him. "Is it?" she said. "The way I mean it," he said. "Yes." He leaned forward slightly in his chair, and his voice was quieter, more stripped of its habitual composure. "I am not talking about absorbing your property into mine. I'm not talking about you managing my household and me managing everything else. I know enough about you to know that would make you miserable, and that is not what I want. I want someone who will sit across the table from me and tell me when I'm wrong, and know the land alongside me, and be present in this life I'm building, not as an addition to it but as the whole point of it." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp between them was steady now. "You are describing something that the law does not currently support," she said. "A married woman in Kansas in 1878 does not own property independently. My land would become yours upon marriage. There is no legal mechanism for what you're describing." "I know," he said, "and I know that matters to you. It should matter to you. It matters to me too because it is unjust." He held her gaze. "I cannot fix the law, but I can give you my word, and you know what my word means, that this land remains yours in every practical sense, that every decision about it is yours, that I will put it in writing in whatever legal form is available to us, and that if the day ever comes when the law changes, we will change the paperwork to match." She studied him. She was very good at reading people. She had needed to be for years. What she read in Daniel Hawkins was the thing she had been reading in him for months without knowing what to do about it, the specific quality of a person who is exactly what they present as, no more concealed, no more complicated, just honest. I am not a practical consideration for you, she said. It was not quite a question. No, he said. Letitia, you have been the best part of every week since you arrived in May. I ride over here more than the cattle situation requires, and I think we both know that. Something in her chest that had been held careful and still for a very long time moved, the way ice moves at the beginning of a thaw, not breaking, just beginning the long process of becoming water. I am not easy to live with, she said. I have opinions and I maintain them, and I do not manage the household quietly in the background, and I will absolutely tell you when I think you are wrong. I know, he said. I am counting on it. She looked down at her hands for a moment and then back up at him, and she made the decision that was, she realized, not really a decision at all, because it had been made weeks ago in the quiet, steady accumulation of October evenings and fenced pastures and apple pie and silence that was never empty. All right, she said. He let out a breath. And then he smiled, the full version, not the partial one she had been cataloging for months, and it was a very good smile, the kind that rearranges what you thought you knew about a person's face. All right, he echoed. He reached across the small table between them and took her hand, not the firm businesslike handshake of their first meeting, but something much more careful, much more deliberate, his fingers folding around hers as though they were something worth holding, and they sat like that in the lamplight with the Kansas wind moving outside and everything between them different now and both of them knowing it. They were married on a Saturday in November, at the small church south of Caldwell. It was cold, a sharp, bright cold with a sky so blue it looked painted. Opal Greer provided a cake. Rosa and Miguel Delgado stood up with them. Clara Finch cried, which she had not expected to do and found slightly embarrassing, and which Letitia found entirely endearing. Hayes attended in a clean shirt with his hat actually removed, which Letitia later learned from Daniel was a gesture that Hayes reserved for occasions of genuine significance, so she considered it deeply honoring. Letitia wore a dress she had made herself, dark blue wool, fitted and straight, with a white collar she had embroidered in the evenings over the preceding 2 weeks. She was not a woman who did things by halves. She was, however, a woman who had her own ideas about what things meant, and the dress she made with her own hands meant exactly what she wanted it to mean. Daniel, beside her at the altar, looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not the theatrical look of romantic paintings, but the real thing. The look of a man seeing something that matters more than almost anything else, and knowing it with his whole self. After the ceremony, as they walked out into the cold, brilliant afternoon, she said to him quietly, "You understand that nothing is actually different. I am still myself." "I know," he said, just as quietly, with his hand warm under her arm. "That's exactly what I married." They went back to her property, their property, and they began the interesting and sometimes difficult process of learning to build a life together. It was not simple. Nothing real was simple. They argued in December about where the grain storage should go, and Letitia was right about it, and he admitted she was right, and she noted in her own mind that him admitting it had not required any of the elaborate negotiations she might have expected. They argued in January about whether to take on a loan for additional cattle, and Daniel was right about it, and she admitted so with equal directness, and moved on. Their first winter together was cold and hard and close and good. The sod house, her sod house, the one she had repaired and cleaned and made inhabitable by her own labor, was small for 2 people but warm, and the smallness of it meant that there was nowhere to be distant, which suited them both, as it turned out, better than they might have predicted. Daniel worked his ranch and she worked her property, and they worked them together, the boundaries between his land and hers becoming less about ownership and more about geography. He knew the cattle. She knew the numbers. She learned to read the trail and he learned to read her accounts, and together they understood things about their situation that neither of them had understood separately. In February, she told him she was pregnant. It was a cold evening and the lamp was going and they were both at the table, she with her accounts book, he with a letter from a cattle buyer he had been drafting, and she said it simply, the way she said most things, and watched his face. What happened to his face was extraordinary. It went through several things very quickly: surprise, then a kind of arrested stillness, then something that was very close to what she had seen on it at the altar in November, the thing that was too large for a single word. He set down his pen. He stood up from the table. He came around to where she was sitting, and he crouched down in front of her chair so that he was at her eye level, the way he did sometimes when he wanted to talk to her directly, without any physical height between them. Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm quite well," she said. "The first month or so of this is reportedly uncomfortable, which I am told is normal. I feel very tired in the mornings." He took both her hands in both of his. His hands were warm and she had come over the winter to know them very well, the exact weight of them, the texture of the calluses, the particular way they held things. "Letitia," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "Daniel," she said gently, because the look on his face required gentleness. "I did not know," he said, "that I could want something this much." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp light was steady and the wind outside was doing what Kansas wind always did, which was everything at once. She squeezed his hands. "I know," she said. "I did not either." Spring came again, and with it the second season of her garden, which she expanded substantially. She was tired and uncomfortable in ways she had not entirely anticipated, and she was also deeply, practically committed to being useful and capable right up to the limits of what her body allowed, which drove Daniel slightly to distraction in the most tender way. He would come in and find her digging at the garden and stand there with his hat in his hands looking at her with an expression that was love and alarm in equal measure. "I am not fragile," she said firmly, more than once. "I know you're not," he said each time, with the patience of a man who was learning something new about how to be protective of someone who did not want to be protected. "Could you perhaps be not fragile closer to the house?" she compromised. This was, she found, the essential ongoing work of being married, not agreement exactly, but the willingness to move toward each other enough to find the ground between two positions. She was not naturally inclined to compromise. Neither was he. But they were both intelligent enough to see that their stubbornness operated in the same register, the same quality of will, just aimed in slightly different directions, and that when they aimed it at the same problem, it was formidable. Caldwell Consolidated came back in May, and this time they did not send representatives. They sent their lawyer, a smooth man from Wichita named Mr. Alderton, who arrived one afternoon at the combined ranch property with an offer that was, he said, the last and best one they would make. Letitia handled the meeting. This was not something she and Daniel had discussed. It was something she simply did, because she had recognized the type, the smooth city lawyer, the careful offer, the underlying threat, and she was better suited to it than Daniel, who tended to get visibly angry in ways that were entirely justified but not strategically helpful. She sat across from Mr. Alderton in the sitting room that used to be just hers, and she listened to the offer with her hands folded in her lap and her face pleasant and absolutely neutral. It was a better offer than the first one, but it was still below fair market value, and more importantly, it was an offer she had no intention of accepting. "Mr. Alderton," she said when he finished, "my husband and I are not interested in selling. We are, however, interested in making it completely clear that if any further pressure is applied to us or to our neighboring properties in this territory, we will be filing a formal complaint with the State Land Office and documenting every instance of what appears to us to be a pattern of coercive acquisition. I have kept thorough records of every interaction with your client's representatives since August of last year. Everything is written down and dated." Mr. Alderton looked at her. He was a man who was accustomed to negotiating with people who were either afraid or greedy, and she was clearly neither, and it appeared to briefly unsettle him. "I hope it does not come to that," he said. "So do I," she said pleasantly. "Good afternoon." He left. Daniel, who had been in the doorway of the kitchen through most of this and had been quiet about it, came into the sitting room and looked at her with an expression that was admiring in a way that made her feel warm from the inside out. "Thorough records," he said. "I have thorough records," she confirmed, "going back to the first visit." "I know you do," he said. He came and sat beside her and took her hand, and he said quietly, "We are not going to lose this place." "No," she agreed. "We are not." Caldwell Consolidated did not come back. Whether it was the records or the legal letter Daniel's lawyer in Caldwell sent them the following week, or simply the fact that a property with two determined owners was considerably less attractive to a coercive acquisition scheme than a single woman alone, she could not say. But they stopped, and the quiet that followed had the quality of a problem that was genuinely resolved rather than merely postponed. Their son was born in August of 1879, on a Tuesday morning that started with a clear sky and ended with a summer storm that came across the prairie like a blue wall. He was healthy and large and loud, and Letitia, who had been through 12 hours of something considerably more difficult than anything else she had experienced in a life that had not been short on difficulty, held him in the evenings quiet after the storm, and felt something that reorganized the inside of herself in a fundamental way. Daniel, sitting on the edge of the bed beside her with his hat nowhere in evidence and his hair disordered, and his face bearing the particular expression of someone who has just witnessed something beyond what they had words for, said, "He looks like you." "He has your nose," she said. "He has a fine nose," Daniel said softly. She laughed quietly, and the sound of it in the August dark was the most content sound she had ever made. They named him James Thomas Hawkins, James for her father, Thomas for Daniel's. He was a vigorous and curious infant who from very early on had strong opinions about the world, which Letitia considered entirely appropriate. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, not without difficulty, not without loss, but full. The ranch grew. The grain operation that Letitia had begun cautiously expanded, and she proved to have a genuine talent for understanding the grain market, for reading the patterns in prices and supply that told her when to sell and when to hold. The combined property grew from 40 plus 230 acres to nearly 400 by 1882, through a combination of careful purchase and one piece of adjacent land that came available when a neighbor decided to go north to Montana. Hayes stayed on as head hand and became something essential to the daily life of the ranch, reliable and steady and quietly fond of James, in the way of men who show affection through practical action rather than words, teaching the boy to track a horse by the bent grass before he was 4. Rosa and Miguel Delgado remained close friends, and their children grew up running in and out of each other's properties. Clara Finch had eventually married a farmer named Robert Pierce and moved to a homestead 8 miles east, and she and Letitia wrote long letters and visited when they could. Opal Greer retired from the boarding house in 1881 and came to live on a small piece of land that Daniel helped her secure at fair price, and which she managed with the same iron efficiency she had brought to 30 years of running a boarding house. She and Letitia had Sunday dinners together twice a month, and Opal held strong opinions about nearly everything, and the conversations were among Letitia's favorites. James started school in 1884, riding to the schoolhouse on a small, sensible pony named Copper, who was ideally suited to the job. He was a serious and thoughtful boy with his mother's brown eyes and his father's capacity for long, comfortable silence, and he loved the prairie with the intuitive love of someone for whom a place is the only landscape that feels natural. In 1885, they had a second child, a daughter they named Elena Rose, who from birth demonstrated a personality that was approximately twice as loud as James in every measurable dimension, and who was adored by everyone in range of her immediately. Daniel held her in the lamplight the first night and looked at her the way he had looked at James, with that too large expression. The one Letitia had come to understand was simply what Daniel Hawkins looked like when he encountered something that mattered more than he had been prepared for. "She has your eyes," he said. "She has your stubbornness," Letitia said. He looked up with a smile. "You don't know that yet." "I know," said Letitia. Alina turned out to have both. By 1887, the ranch was not the modest homestead that Letitia had arrived to rebuild 9 years earlier. It was a real and substantial holding cattle and grain both, 4 full-time hands, a proper barn, an expanded house that Daniel and Hayes had built out over 2 summers, with a kitchen large enough for the work Letitia used it for and a sitting room with bookshelves, because Letitia had always bought books when she could and the collection had grown considerably. She still kept the accounts herself. This was not a matter of distrust. It was a matter of it being the work she was best suited to and the work that had always been the backbone of what she was. She taught James to read an account book before he was 7, and she intended to teach Alina as well, and she had told Daniel early on that if he ever wanted to know the exact financial position of everything they owned, he had only to ask her, and he could always trust what she told him. He had told her once, in the sitting room on a winter evening when the accounts were spread across the table between them and the fire was going and the children were asleep, that he considered her the most capable person he had ever met. She had looked up from the accounts. "More capable than Hayes," she said. "Hayes is capable," Daniel said, with perfect seriousness. "But Hayes cannot read a contract's clause. He makes up for it in other ways," she said. "He does," Daniel agreed. "But you are still the most capable person I have ever met." He said it simply and without performance, the way he said all true things. She looked at him across the accounts and the lamplight and the life they had built together, and she said, equally simply, "You are the best decision I have ever made." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was not a dramatic moment. It was better than dramatic. It was real, entirely real, the way all the best things between them had been, quiet and direct and full of the weight of everything that had happened before it. The winter of 1888 was one of the hard ones, a blizzard in January that drove the temperature so far below anything useful that the ink froze in the inkwell, and they went through twice their expected firewood. They lost 4 cattle to it, which was a loss they could absorb, and Hayes's smallest finger on his right hand froze at the tip during the storm, which resolved without losing the finger but left the skin there tender for the rest of the season. Otherwise they came through it intact, and the spring after a hard winter always felt, Letitia thought, like something earned in a way that springs after easy winters did not. That spring, in April, Daniel came in from the north pasture one afternoon with something in his face that she had learned over 10 years to read as a man who has seen something that moved him. She looked up from the table where she was drafting a letter to the grain buyer in Wichita. "What is it?" she said. "The blue larks," he said. "The ones that come through in April. They're back, hundreds of them in the north grass." She set down her pen. She put on her coat. They walked out together across the spring afternoon, through the north gate and into the long grass of the north pasture where a decade ago his cattle had grazed on a handshake deal with a man who had died. And the birds were there, a great moving, dipping cloud of them, blue and small and impossibly alive, covering the grass in a shifting wave and lifting and settling and lifting again. She stood beside him in the April wind, and they watched the birds for a long time without saying anything. James would want to see this, she thought. Alina would try to catch one. Daniel's hand found hers in the familiar, easy way of 10 years of finding. "Same thing," he said quietly, and she knew what he meant, knew it the way she had known it the first time he said it, but more deeply now, with more of herself. The ranch was the partnership, and the partnership was the ranch, and all of it was the life she had built and been given and chosen with both eyes open, all at once. "Same thing," she agreed. James Hawkins grew up to be a man who had his mother's intelligence for numbers and his father's understanding of the land. and when he was old enough to be genuinely useful, he became a real working partner in the ranch operation. Not because anyone insisted on it, but because he had grown up loving it and could not imagine being anywhere else. He was methodical and steady and good, and Daniel had the particular quiet pride of a man watching his child become someone worth knowing. Eleanor, who had always been something else entirely, decided at 14 that she wanted to be a teacher like Clara Pierce, and Letitia, who believed absolutely in a person's right to choose the shape of their own life, supported this with everything she had. By the time Eleanor was 16, she was already helping at the school and reading everything she could find, and Letitia wrote letters to find her a proper teaching college, which took 2 years of letter writing and finding the right connections, but which eventually yielded a real place at a women's college in Lawrence that had opened its teaching program to women who could demonstrate academic aptitude. Eleanor left for Lawrence in 1901 at 17, and Letitia stood at the wagon with her hand in Daniel's and watched her go, this loud and bright and opinionated daughter of theirs, and felt the particular combination of fierce pride and specific sorrow that is the currency of watching your children begin to move away toward the lives they have been building all along. "She will be fine," Daniel said. "She will be extraordinary," Letitia said. "That is slightly different." He squeezed her hand. "She learned from the best." She looked up at him with the brown eyes that had seen enough of the world by now to be both serious and glad, and she said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. The years after Eleanor left were their own in a different way than the early years had been their own, not the urgent, building years of establishing something from nothing, but a different kind of having. The ranch was solid. James and his wife, a quiet and sensible woman named Helen, ran the eastern operations. Letitia still kept the accounts, though James was learning them now, and she still rode out with Daniel when the weather was good, which it often was not but sometimes was, to check the north pasture or the fence line, or simply to be in the land together in the particular way they had always been. She was in her mid-40s now and Daniel in his early 50s, and the years had settled on them both in the way of people who have lived strenuously and in open air. The lines of weather and laughter and sustained attention in his face, the particular quality that long sustained purpose gives to a person's bearing. She still thought he was the most honest face she had ever looked at. He still thought she was the most capable person he had ever met. Neither of them found it necessary to say these things very often, because they said them by other means, in the daily and unspectacular currency of a shared life. Rosa Delgado's husband Miguel died in 1900, of a chest ailment that the doctor in Caldwell could not fix, and Rosa came through it in the way of people who have been very deeply loved, with the grief completely present and the love outlasting it and neither diminishing the other. Letitia was with her the week after and the month after and the year after, the way Rosa had been with her in the early, uncertain years when the frontier was new and everything was still being established. It was what friends were for, and they had been friends for long enough to know that without having to say it. Hayes retired in 1899, not because he was told to, but because his knees had finally arrived at an opinion about 30 years of outdoor labor that could no longer be argued with, and Daniel found him a small house in Caldwell and arranged for a regular delivery of supplies from the ranch, which Hayes accepted with the dignified lack of ceremony that was his natural mode of receiving things. He lived another 12 years in Caldwell, becoming eventually a fixture of the place in the way of people who have been too many things in too many places to be easily categorized. Opal Greer had died in 1892, which had been a real loss, a loss of a particular kind of clarity from the world, the kind that comes from someone who has spent a long life paying genuine attention. Letitia had sat with her at the end and held her hand, and Opal had said, in the brisk, clear way she said everything, "You did well, Letitia Bailey." And Letitia had said, "It's Letitia Hawkins now," and Opal had said, "I know what I said." And that had been the last thing she said clearly, which was an excellent last thing. Alina came home from Lawrence in 1905, a qualified teacher with ideas about education that were several decades ahead of the curriculum she had been assigned. And she came home changed in the particular way of someone who has been somewhere real and learned something real. And she was still entirely herself, still loud, still direct, still the person who had tried to catch blue larks at 5 years old with her absolute certainty that this time she would manage it. She taught at the school south of Caldwell, the same school where Clara Pierce had taught a generation before, and she was an extraordinary teacher, which Letitia had expected and which turned out to be correct. She also, in 1907, married a doctor who had come to Caldwell to establish a practice. A man named George Adler, 29 years old to Alina's 22, from Ohio, thoughtful and somewhat earnest and completely unable to resist Daniel Hawkins, which Letitia found both predictable and endearing. The wedding was in the spring, on the ranch property, because Alina had said she wanted to get married where she had grown up and not in a church that didn't know her. And the afternoon was mild, and the prairie grass was just greening, and the blue larks were back in the north pasture. Letitia stood beside Daniel watching their daughter married in the April light, the light that fell across 40 acres of Kansas, and then some that had been the foundation of everything. And she felt the full weight of all of it at once, the past and the present and the shape of the future going out ahead of them all. And it was not a sad weight but a significant one. James's wife, Helen, had their first child in 1903, a boy they named Thomas Daniel Hawkins, and Letitia held him the first time with the particular knowledge of someone who had held her own babies and knew what she was looking at, the full, possible, determined face of a person who had just arrived and had everything ahead of them still to do. Thomas was followed in 1906 by a sister named Clara, after Clara Pierce, who was touched to the point of tears when she heard, and who by now was a grandmother herself, living still on her farm 8 miles east and writing the long, elegant letters she had always written. The ranch in 1910 was not what Letitia had arrived to find in 1878. It was barely recognizable as the same 40 acres of wild grass and a failing sod house where she had stood alone in the wind and felt the specific feeling of possibility. The house was a proper house now, solid wood and wide-windowed, with a kitchen garden that bore no resemblance to the scraggly thing she had first dug from the wild growth of her great uncle's neglected plot. The barn was large and well-maintained. The land stretched out in every direction with the particular quality of land that has been well cared for, not subdued or dominated, but understood and worked with and respected. On an October evening in 1910, an October that arrived with cool blue air and the last gold of the turning grass, and the particular smell of the Kansas autumn that Letitia had come to love with the love of someone who chose a place, rather than simply landed in it, she and Daniel sat outside on the porch of the house that had grown up around the core of the small sod house that had been the beginning of all of it. He had built her a proper porch in 1885. He had built it south-facing because she had told him she wanted to watch the sunset from it, and he had built it wide enough for 2 chairs with room between them to set a table, because she had told him she wanted to be able to put her coffee cup somewhere. These were the kinds of things he had always done, listened carefully and built accordingly, so that what he made was shaped by what she needed and what she wanted, and not by his idea of what those things ought to be. James and Helen's children were asleep inside. Alina and George had come for the week and were also somewhere inside, probably reading, because they were that kind of people. The ranch was quiet in the way of October evenings, the particular prairie quiet that is not silence but a kind of carried breathing of the land, the wind in the dry grass, the far cattle in the north field, the last birds going south. Letitia's coffee was cooling on the table between the 2 chairs. Daniel's hat was on the porch rail. He was looking at the horizon in the way he had always looked at it, with a kind of partnership with the distance that she had always loved in him. "I have been thinking," she said. He turned his head to look at her with that steady, present attention that had never changed in 32 years, had never become assumption, had never become the kind of looking that didn't really look. "About what?" he said. "About when I arrived," she said. "About what I thought it was going to be." "What did you think it was going to be?" She considered the question honestly. "Solitary," she said. "I thought it was going to be solitary and hard and mine. I thought those three things were inseparable from each other." He was quiet, listening. "I was wrong about the solitary," she said. "The hard and the mine were both true, but I was wrong about what mine could mean." She looked at the horizon. "I did not know that mine could include you without ceasing to be mine." He reached across the table and took her hand, and his hand was still warm and still calloused and still familiar in the specific way of something that had been known so long it had become part of the landscape of self. "The first day," he said, "when you were on the roof." "I was laying the sod backwards," she said. "You were," he said. "And you turned it over and thanked me without making it into anything other than what it was. A woman taking information that was useful and applying it. I had never seen anything quite like it." She laughed softly. "That is a very ordinary thing." "It was not ordinary," he said. "I had watched men's pride cost them their cattle, their land, their friendships, everything. And you just turned the sod over and said thank you. I thought, there is a person who is more interested in the truth of things than in the appearance of things. And that was the beginning." She looked at him. The particular light of the October evening was on his face, and it was a face she had looked at for 32 years, and it still held things she found worth looking at, still the same honesty in it, the same quality of being exactly what it presented as. "You told me," she said, "that a ranch and a partner were the same thing. I thought it was deflection at first." "It wasn't," he said. "No," she said. "I know that now. I knew it then too, I think. I just needed a moment to be certain I was reading it right." "You read it right," he said. They sat in the October evening, and the land breathed around them. And inside the house their grandchildren were sleeping, and their daughter was reading. And the accounts book was on the desk with everything in order, and the north pasture, where Daniel's cattle had grazed since before she arrived, was full of dry grass going golden in the last light. And all of it was hers, and all of it was his. And there was no longer any tension in those two facts, because there had not been for a very long time. "I have a question for you," Daniel said after a while. "Ask it," she said. "If you could go back," he said carefully, "to the stagecoach that day, to standing in the mud in Caldwell with your trunk and your derringer, knowing everything you know now, would you make the same choices?" She thought about it with the genuine seriousness the question deserved. "Every one," she said, "including you." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to the back of it, the gesture he had always used to say the things that exceeded words, and she felt it the way she always felt it, not as a diminishment or a prettiness, but as the exact right language for the exact right thing. The stars were coming up over the Kansas prairie, the enormous stars that cities forget about, the stars that had looked down on this land for thousands of years before anyone she knew had arrived in it, before the Kishom Trail, or the homesteaders, or the cattle operations, or any of it. The night air was sharp and clear and smelled of dried grass and cold coming, and the particular mineral sweetness of the earth when it has finished its summer work and is resting. Letitia Hawkins, who had once been Letitia Bailey standing in the mud of Caldwell with a deed and a determination and no clear idea of what was coming, sat on her porch in October and looked at her land and her sky, and the man beside her, who was both the best decision she had ever made and the most constant truth of the last 32 years of her life. And she felt, completely and without reservation, the thing that had been promised by that door opening in her chest on the day the lawyer's letter arrived. She was home, not just in the place, though the place was hers in every way she had worked and fought and planned for it to be, but home in the larger sense, home in the sense of having arrived, at last and fully, at the life she had been trying to reach since she was old enough to understand that there was a reaching to be done. Daniel looked at the stars. She looked at him looking at the stars. Inside, someone a leaner, it sounded like, laughed at something, the bright, carrying laugh of their daughter that had always sounded like something released. "Come on," Letitia said, and stood and offered him her hand. "It's getting cold. Let's go inside." He took her hand and stood, the way he always took whatever she offered without fuss, with both hands, as though it was the most natural thing on earth. They went inside together, into the warmth and light of the house they had built, into the sound of their family, into the long, quiet, good evening of a life that was, in every way that mattered, complete.